Alright, so in this chapter, we're going to be talking about children and adolescents. So, throughout this, what we're going to talk about first in this lecture is a little bit about the physiology and the anatomy of children versus adults, and particularly focused on those areas that are more related to exercise. Okay, so just to kind of give you kind of an outline of the learning outcomes or things that I expect you guys to know after going through this section, is you really should be able to discuss the differences, physical and physiological, between children and adults. So, particularly how skeletal muscle and bone they develop throughout the lifespan, how body composition changes, strength, flexibility, their reaction time, their coordination, posture, temperature regulation, cardiorespiratory fitness, and also looking at their heart rate responses to exercise and rest, and how that differs between adults. Now, here I have some good examples. We just want to set some terms right off at the beginning of when I say children versus adolescents, what age do I mean? And basically, children would be considered anyone younger than 13 years old, and adolescents would be considered anyone between the ages of 13 to 18, and after 18, they would be considered adults. So, really, the main difference here is when puberty starts, right? And typically for girls, that may start around 12 years old. For boys, closer to 14. And what we also find is that as they grow, that typically girls will stop growing around age 14, boys around 17. But they can grow. It is different depending on the individual. But here's just a fun example of my little niece. She's about 6 years old, and then my nephew, who's about 13 years old. So there is quite a stark difference between them and physically what they can do. So I would definitely need to adjust my exercise based on what their development. Now, if you look throughout the lifespan, going from a baby to an old adult, as far as our body size and body composition, it really changes dramatically for those first 13 to 18 years until we reach that adult height and size. But then as we get older, we notice that we start to have changes that occur. Our height doesn't change too much. We might actually shrink a little bit, but we stay fairly the same as far as our stature goes. Now, when we're born, we find that basically there's a steady increase in height and weight throughout the childhood, but then there's a rapid growth that occurs, particularly in the bone, as those epiphyseal plates, and those are the growth plates, that they tend to, the cartilage there in those growth plates grows, it proliferates and get ossified into long bone, right? So we get longer, those bones get longer and we get taller, okay? But eventually those epiphyseal plates will stop and will be closed off to where we can't grow any taller, okay? Now, as far as our fat-free mass, okay, that tends to also increase, particularly the skeletal muscle, and a similar manner in height in both boys and girls. However, we notice that adult females have about 30% less skeletal muscle mass than males do. So there is a difference in males and females when we look at just the skeletal muscle mass. And we find that the lower and upper extremity bone mass tends to increase in childhood, but it even grows faster during adolescence. So let's talk a little bit about the neuromuscular control and the development of the nervous system in children. So with the nervous system, this is the messenger in the body that basically communicates with the muscles and tells the muscles what to do. So part of the nervous system is that we have these neurons that are basically branch out and they connect to each other and they connect to muscle. So when we're small and developing, those neurons aren't very well developed yet. But as we get older, those neurons start to begin to branch more and make more connections so that the message of to move a muscle can travel quicker throughout the nervous system. Another thing that happens as we grow from childhood to adulthood is that these neurons are able to synthesize neurotransmitters more efficiently. Okay? So a neurotransmitter, all it is that chemical messenger that communicates from the nervous system to another, or from one neuron to another neuron, or from a neuron to the muscle. Okay. So acetylcholine would be an example of a neurotransmitter. Okay. And another thing that happens in the nervous system as we grow older is that the myelin sheath starts to develop more. So I don't know if you've ever played catch with a child, but if you throw a ball at them, watch their reaction. So it's almost like a delayed response where they can't react immediately to the ball coming at them. So the ball will actually hit them sometimes or go past them, and then you'll see their hands clap together. So it's a shorter reaction time. So reaction time in children is going to be a lot slower until they start to develop more of those neuron connections. And along with that, reaction time is also coordination, so that ability to basically use their muscles to move certain ways to keep themselves balanced. Okay, so their coordination might not be that great because those neurons have not yet developed the connections between each other. So as you're working with a child, that might be one area that you might want to focus on, is working on their reaction time coordination to help develop that neuromuscular control, that connection between the nervous system and the muscles. So another area we need to talk about is how muscular strength and flexibility differ in children. Now it's quite obvious. We know that adults are stronger than children, and children tend to be pretty flexible. So that is very well known and understood. But with muscular strength, what we see is that it does basically develop and increase with age in both boys and girls. And that increase in strength is related to increases in their body weight, their height, increase in fat-free mass and muscle mass. But we do notice that there is a difference between boys and girls as children are developing. Girls tend to be more flexible than guys, and especially when we reach that puberty age, what we'll find. Now, some areas that we really need to think about in terms of children and exercise are their cardiorespiratory responses, because these tend to be a little bit more different than adults, and we need to recognize the differences here. So with heart rate, what we find is that children have higher resting heart rates than adults. So a lot of times it'll be anywhere from 100 to 110 beats per minute, whereas an adult typically might have resting heart rates anywhere from 70 to 80 beats per minute. But what happens is that as that nervous system begins to mature, that particularly the parasympathetic system, that activity will increase as children get older, which will actually slow down the heart rate. Now, another thing that can change or that's different between adults and children is the respiratory frequency, or how often we breathe air in and out. So children typically have higher respiratory frequencies than adults, but those respiratory frequencies will decrease as they get older. Now, an interesting thing that as children, as they exercise, that they actually can recover faster than adults. So what do I mean by recover? Well, let's say that they're exercising and their heart rate goes from 100 to 150, 160 beats per minute, right? And then a minute after exercise, you find, well, their heart rate is back down to 100. Now, if the same adult did that exercise, he actually might take him 2 or 3 minutes to get that heart rate back down to resting. So it just takes longer for the body to get back to resting levels as far as their heart rate goes, respiratory frequency, and stroke volume. And it's really not, we're not quite sure why that happens. We definitely see at higher intensities that children seem to recover better. But some of the reasons might be is that there might be a smaller exercise induced increase in, for example, adrenaline, epinephrine activity. There also might be a faster clearance of hydrogen ions, so the body can recover quicker. There also is probably closer distance between the muscles and capillaries, so that would make a shorter diffusion time in children. And there's also just, they're just smaller bodies, right? So there's a smaller decrease in plasma volume compared to adults, which can affect stroke volume and heart rate. So although the apparent reason for why children recover quicker isn't known, those may be some possibilities. Now, if we look at stroke volume, what we'll find is that it's lower in children compared to adults. Okay. And because of that lower stroke volume, typically their cardiac output also tends to be lower than in adults. And when we look at blood pressure, it is also it's lower than adults in both the systolic blood pressure and diastolic, although diastolic doesn't tend to be too much of a difference. And part of that is that the arteries are just less stiff when you're younger. But as you get older, with atherosclerosis building up and other things, that your arteries tend to also get stiffer, and that causes your blood pressure to go up. So it's just those more compliant arteries that the children have that allows them to have lower blood pressure. Now they also have a good amount of blood flow and oxygen extraction during exercise. But children and adolescents tend to actually have a greater oxygen cost during exercise, meaning they need to use more oxygen during a specific type of exercise than adults do. Now, part of the reason why they actually might use more oxygen is just because they're less efficient in the actual movement of the exercise. And what plays a role there would be the nervous system, that just with the coordination like we talked about before, that they're just not as efficient with their movements yet. And another factor also might be is just that the hormone response is not as well developed when they're younger, but that might improve with age as far as the regulation and extraction of oxygen, and also different types of fuels like carbohydrates, fats, okay, to use during exercise. Now, if we actually look at their peak oxygen consumption, or their peak maximal, or their peak oxygen consumption, it is lower in children, but that can increase with age. And what we'll find is that generally girls tend to have lower peak VO2s than boys due to their body composition, their lower blood hemoglobin, and just their more sedentary behaviors, generally speaking. So those are some differences that you might see in cardiorespiratory function in children versus adults. Now, another big thing that we need to consider as we're looking at differences in children and adults, is how they regulate temperature. So if we just look at their sweat production, it's less than adults. Okay, if you've ever noticed that in children, it doesn't seem like they sweat as much as an adult would. And part of that reason is that they have sweat glands, and they actually have more sweat glands than adults, but the output, or how much sweat each sweat glands produce, is lower than adults. Then the second factor of why they produce lower sweat or is that the temperature at which sweating starts tends to be higher in children. So let's say that if my body reached a certain temperature, let's just say 99 degrees, and I started to sweat, in children it might not start until it's 100 degrees. So it's just a higher temperature set point at which they would start sweating. Now another thing, as far as their heat production goes, how hot their body gets, is that they do also actually produce more heat per kilogram body weight during activities than adults do. And that may be also partially explained by just the inefficient movements they have when they exercise. And also, if we were to actually have them exercise at basically the same temperature at 100 degrees, okay, as adults would, they couldn't last as long as adults because it would just be too hot for them, and they couldn't really handle that temperature very well. So with that, however, we do need to make sure that they are staying hydrated. Just with different habits and just not paying attention to it, you may get children who are actually dehydrated quite often. So you need to make an emphasis that they do stay hydrated, because that will help keep them cool when they do produce that sweat, so that they can produce some. Now, one thing that we're finding more often is that we're having a lot more children who are obese, and what we found is that they acclimatize actually slower to the heat than children who aren't obese. And that may be partially explained just to the increased abdominal fat in adults, so the heat becomes more trapped and can't be transferred as well. So what we need to watch out for is also those children who might be a little bit obese, that they may have a harder time actually adapting to heat stress. Alright, so those are kind of the main things as far as the physiology that I wanted you guys to focus on with children, because a lot of those will be pertinent to the type of exercise program that you develop for them. Okay? And different things that you need to be aware of as you're doing an exercise session with them. So now that you've kind of covered that and done the reading over the differences in children and adults, there's going to be a quiz on Blackboard, basically over the material that I discussed in this video, and anything in the books that's pertinent to what I've discussed today. So make sure that you get that done this weekend. I'll also post up an article for you guys to read about resistance training and children, which is pretty neat. Okay, I will see you guys on Monday.